Welcome to Learning Unit 2. We'll be discussing the evolution and characteristics of mass communication cultures in this video. Learning Unit 2 is all about the study of mass communication. In this learning unit, we learn about the definition, the development, and the characteristics of mass communication culture. We also explore theory in terms of theoretical approaches to mass communication research. We ask questions like, who is the communicator in mass communication? What do we mean by medium? What is the message and what do we mean by audience? We then look at what is the theory applied in mass communication. I know you're ready to get started, so let's look at mass communication. Turn to page 91, which is from our theme 1, mass communication culture. It's an introduction into how did mass communication evolve over the time and what is the characteristics of each mass communication culture. What is mass communication? Throughout history, people had media to communicate about matters of public interest. In this next section, we talk about all the different involvements of the different periods of time when we had to communicate with one another. And each period would have a certain sort of device or a certain way of communicating, which is quite interesting. So mass communication has evolved over time about how we can communicate with others, but in terms of just, our friends, our family, or the public, in terms of the masses. And this has evolved from oral mass communication culture, dominant written and printed mass communication culture, a dominant electronic public mass communication culture, and last, increasingly digital culture. The oral dominant culture talks about there was no industry, so pre-industrial, pre-literacy, before writing and reading existed. All we had to communicate with another person was the spoken word, which is our verbal communication. So the only way that I could talk to somebody in that cave was through speaking in the spoken word, expressing my ideas, my values, my attitudes. There was no written form, so no newspapers, no radio, no records, reports, or any sort of tangible writing. The spoken word was used to communicate about views, politics, laws, anything of human interest. Here are the following characteristics of the oral public communication culture. First, we need to understand that if we had to communicate with the public, it would have to be face-to-face. The meaning of language was very highly specific in the local region and practical to everyday concerns. Language was then concrete, and it had to be very, very specific and solid in terms of the symbols, meaning that you had to mean what you say and say what you mean. Very little read between the lines because all we're relying on is the spoken word. In this case, the context of oral culture does rely on memory. People were expected to use their memory and keep that accessible to what is relevant to communicate about myth, law, and beliefs. In some societies, there's still people that do not use the written word and they cannot read, and they rely still on this oral dominant communication. They will still rely on face-to-face contact and the verbal spoken word. And histories are also still told through stories and myths about your ethical behavior, such as what you should do and what you should not do. These stories will also relate to human experience of nature, relationships, and ancestor worship. And those beliefs can be passed on from generation to generation. An example of a culture that may still rely on the oral communication culture would be the Amish culture. But then again, they still have Bibles and reading texts, but it's a culture that dominantly relies on speaking and the face-to-face communication. This concludes the oral communication culture. Are you ready for written communication culture? Now written is beginning in the period. Around 6,000 years ago, there were visual recordings began with carvings and cave paintings. And then 3,000 years into that, the phonetic alphabet was known and writing dates back as far as 800 BC. Let's look at the characteristics of the written print. As writing is getting introduced, the spoken word became more casual and unofficial in terms of the written world. Think about it. Do you trust more a written contract than a verbal contract? Therefore, the written became more impersonal, more formal, more objective, more permanent than the spoken word, and more closer to the truth. A written contract is more binding than an oral contract. A published account is more reliable than a verbal account, and so on. You can read through all those examples on page 93. Writing allows the recording of events, the creation of history. It can also relate to mathematics and the logic to neat scripts. It's also existence and objective knowledge, and it's possible for science. Therefore, there must be an accurate written recordings and so on and so on. Since the emergence of the Greek alphabet, it took 2,000 years before the printing press, and this forms part of our next communication culture. The beginning of the information revolution started with the 1450s with Johann Gutenberg, who invented the printing press. This was the art of publishing and advancing literacy. Printed documents were usually religious, like a Bible, legal and scientific, that was available to the masses than the elite. The printing press changed the conduction of politics, education, religion, and art. Before then, only the church would have the Bible, and everyone had to rely on the church to spread information, values, and beliefs. But when Johann had invented the printing press, he allowed mass consumption of literacy and allowing everyone, in terms of the public, to access information. And then from there, the Bible was spread. So within 300 years, human adoption of new institutions, schools, organizations, newspapers started to take shape because of this. The printing press had created an entirely new information and mass communication culture. The next one is electronic communication culture. As the written word undermines the authority of spoken word, electronic media undermines the authority of written and print word. What we mean by this is, even though you're reading in your textbook and you see all the dates, you might say, I'm going to research this further. I trust more what's going online than in what is, in the textbook. I think the textbook is fixed towards maybe just 2018 or 2007. And I'm going to go and research this a little bit further and trust what is online, what's on television, and so on. Then became the introduction of the telegraph in 1837. The telegraph, which you might have heard on the Titanic, is this machine through the coding. It will sound like this. Da-da-da-da. Well, I'm kind of doing a poor job of it. Maybe like this. And the reason why the telegraph was so important is it was one of the first sort of mediums to start the introduction of changing the way the form of the message is being portrayed, the volume that it sends out, and the speed that it can be produced. Sorry. So in that way, they said that the telegraph was one of the first inventions that set off the volume of speed of information that sort of transcended the telegraph. It began to demolish time and space because the way that it sent information was far more impressive than the invention of the printing press. Electronic communication from there started to take off rapidly in the 19th century. From the telegraph, or just someone in the room started doing the photography and the film brought about the graphic revolution, and the image culture replaced written and printed word as the dominant means and started to show a portrayal of reality. The discovery of the telegraph was a precursor of radio and then broadcasting. We could say that the telegraph came about the early 1900s. You can always Google that through the electronic communication culture allows you to do this. But remember, the radio had been introduced in the late 1920s to like 1930s, and it took about 50 to 70 years before we got an introduction of media technology. We could say that after radio, television would be the dominant media of our times. Maybe you agree or maybe you disagree, but television seems to be the dominant media that can cross boundaries in terms of showing and marketing different news and networks and spreading that information and opinions. It is worthy to mention Marshall McLuhan, who had coined the term, "the medium is the message." He felt that it was strongly influenced by what the public sees based off the medium. He felt that what you have in terms of a medium, such as radio or television or your cell phone, is largely influencing the message that you are seeing there. He felt that by everyone being a part of technology, they're also excluding everyone who does not have this technology and therefore creating their own global village. The process of bridging time and space also was initiated by the telegraph and has now continued with television and today the internet with Google. Television does also break boundaries and also cross-pollination between cultures, being able to learn about other cultures. But with so much information out there with the internet. We also have other sort of issues such as fake news, which is how do we know this is correct online or this is correct over here on this website? We have covered mass communication cultures. In the next video, we're going to learn about the theory of mass communication. Make sure to write down any notes that you don't understand about this, but I know you got it. It's just the evolution of mass communication cultures.